Throughout the trial, Socrates claims an agnosticism with regard to the nature of death. One argument that he gives for this is that his daimon has not alerted him to any danger during the trial, and now that he's been condemned, this can only mean that there is nothing to fear in death. Since he does not know what will happen to him after death, it would be absurd for him to fear it and to make important decisions based on this. It might well be that, in fact, death is something positive, and then he would have acted in a misguided fashion by changing his convictions out of fear of it. At the end of the work, after he has, in fact, been condemned, Socrates reflects more on this subject in his parting words to the jury. These reflections anticipate some of the content of the Phaedo, which purports to be an account of his last conversation before his execution by drinking hemlock. At the end of the text, he sets up a dichotomy to address the issue. Quote, "Death is one or the other of two things. Either the dead are nothing, as it were, and have no perception of anything, or else, as some people say, death is really a kind of change, of a relocation of the soul from its residence here to another place." He then proceeds to explore both possibilities. If death just means a kind of sound sleep, then this would be better than the many nights when one is plagued by dreams and worries. He then turns to the other possibility. If death is a continued life in Hades, then this is not a bad thing. In this case, Socrates says he would have the opportunity to meet all of the great poets and heroes from the past. He would delight in having the leisure to talk with them and inquire of them as he has done with his fellow Athenians. If this is what death holds in store for him, then he has nothing to worry about. Here we see an entirely different understanding of death than the one we saw earlier in Gilgamesh, the Old Testament, and Homer. Gilgamesh was terrified by death and undertakes a long and perilous expedition in order to find the key to immortality. Enkidu paints a picture of utter misery and despair of the dead souls in the underworld. The Hebrew conception of Sheol is likewise portrayed as a miserable place where everyone ends. Job laments the leveling effect of death that reduces everyone, righteous and sinful, to the same fate. The Mesopotamian and Jewish pictures of the underworld are not much different from the Greek Hades as portrayed in Book 11 of the Odyssey. We recall the famous lament of the shade of Achilles, quote, "I would rather follow the plow as a thrall to another man than be a king over all the perished dead." According to this view, death is something to be feared and avoided. Socrates, however, gives it an entirely different interpretation. He assumes, for the sake of argument, that there is an underworld as in Gilgamesh and Homer, but it's not a miserable place. On the contrary, he claims, the dead souls in Hades are, quote, "happier than people here in every respect, and especially for the rest of time they are deathless." Socrates thus presents a positive view of life after death. The key here is that the dead souls will be judged, and if they have been virtuous in life, then they have nothing to fear. He claims, quote, "There's nothing bad that can happen to a good man, whether in life or after he has died." Socrates' view of judgment and afterlife seems in some ways to foreshadow that of Christianity. This is an important step in the development of the conception of individuality and subjectivity. For Socrates, humans should be more attentive to cultivating their moral character, or as he says, the goodness of the souls. They should focus more on this than on the pursuit of money, fame, and other such mundane things. The good people will be rewarded by a good afterlife. The Mesopotamian and traditional Greek conception presents the underworld as having a leveling effect, with great princes and slaves all suffering the same fate. Socrates seems to believe that in fact the moral character of the individual will determine the fate that one will receive. This is a new way of thinking. Prior to this, as we've repeatedly seen, the fate of individuals was something decided ahead of time, once and for all, and was independent of any achievement or character trait of the individual. Now, according to Socrates' view, the individual can, by his own actions and moral character, play a role in determining his fate. Socrates thus gives human beings a radical new sense of agency and value as individuals. He's thus in many ways the forerunner of our modern conception of individuality and subjectivity. Socrates repeatedly emphasizes that it's cowardly to fear death and try to avoid it at all costs. Compare this to the story of Gilgamesh, who's terrified by death and, in a sense, after the death of Enkidu, dedicates the rest of his life to finding a way to avoid it. In the eyes of Socrates, this would be a cowardly form of behavior, but for the Mesopotamian worldview, Gilgamesh is a great hero. Socrates presents a new value system to the world. As we've seen in both Gilgamesh and Homer, the primary business of life was to be a great warrior. The goal was to attain everlasting fame by means of one's heroic actions. This created a developed warrior ethic with a set of virtues and vices associated with it. Gilgamesh is keen to take on the giant Humbaba merely for the sake of gaining fame. Likewise, the heroes in Homer are consistently portrayed as pursuing fame and honor. In Herodotus, for example, the Greeks are lauded for their heroic stands against the mighty Persians at the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae. We can also see this in evidence in Thucydides' portrayal of the Peloponnesian War. In the funeral oration, Pericles makes it clear that the goal for Athens is to maintain its great empire. Military conquest and imperialism are seen in a positive light and are regarded as highly valuable ends. Now Socrates comes and dismisses all of this as meaningless. He's critical of all these kinds of activities since they focus on something outward, gaining fame, the accumulation of wealth by means of military conquest, etc. He believes that, in the end, these all amount to nothing. Instead, he urges people to turn the focus inward to their own subjective life as individuals, or as he says, to their souls. In Greek life at the time, this was a radical new thought. The idea that the individual was so important in the way Socrates believed was previously unthinkable.